Empathy is a matter of two people's perceptions.
Right.
It's my perception of you.
Right.
It's your perception of whether I'm really seeing you or not. People don't realize how much others want to connect, and so they avoid trying. We all know the feeling of sitting down in a plane and the person sits next to you and they look really nice, but you're like, oh man, if I try to talk to this person, they're gonna put their headphones on, they're gonna say something, it's gonna be so awkward, they're gonna hate me. If you actually try it, you learn that that never happens, almost never.
Whenever you have a company that shows a lot of empathy to their employees or takes care of them or does things that are, not purely profiteering, maybe have a austerely capitalistic sense, it turns out those companies outperform other companies that don't do it. And so
Any disagreement, what's this? Marital spat, conflict between a product team, people can easily get in a state of threat. And one of the best things to do to avoid that or to de-escalate that conflict is to try to flip yourself to genuine curiosity. So if you know you're gonna have a conversation with someone where you know you disagree about something, one of the first things that I suggest that people do is
So, welcome, Jamil. Thanks for being here. Today on Don't Be a Jerk, we're diving into something deceptively radical, empathy. And, this isn't like the soft and fuzzy, be nice kind. This is empathy as a skill, as a strategy, maybe even as a survival tool in a dividing world. And our guest, Dr. Jamil Zaki, you're a professor of psychology at Stanford. You're author of an amazing book called The War for Kindness. You've done TED Talks. And your research, and this is why I'm so grateful you're here, is focused on empathy not just being something you're born with, but being a muscle you can train. And so I want to cite two studies to get it to the budget.
Yeah.
So the first is, there is this University of Michigan study that tracked nearly 14,000 college students, I think from like 1979 to 2009. And over those 30 years, self-reported empathy has declined by about 40%. And what that means is people are having trouble saying, I know what it would feel like to be in someone else's shoes, which is a really hard stat to say out loud.
Yeah.
Now, to your point of the kind of muscle you could build, the counter study to that is there is a study that was in 2013 by psychologists David Kidd and Emmanuel Castano that found that when people do certain things, it can very quickly increase your empathy. And one of the examples of those things is just reading 10 minutes of literary fiction, which is so interesting. So I'm so excited today to explore how empathy works, why it's under siege, how leaders, entrepreneurs, and communities can fight and win the war for kindness. So, Jamil, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Healey. And what a great setup. Those two studies are in this really interesting tension with each other. And I remember each of them, when they happened. I started studying empathy 20 years ago.
Wow.
And I was mostly focused on the neuroscience of empathy. What happens in your brain when you try to understand somebody, when two people get each other, when you care about somebody and decide to help them.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember in 2009, this University of Michigan study came out by my friend Sarah Conrath that found that actually empathy appeared to be declining in the United States. And if you looked at the curve, it actually was not linear. So empathy declined a little bit from 1979 to 2000, and it fell off a cliff in the beginning of the 21st century. And I remember talking to Sarah. I called her because I was so startled and upset by this finding. I said, this is a disaster. We are losing our capacity to be together.
Our humanity.
Our humanity. And it's, as you said, not just this shared humanity doesn't just help us feel good. It's what allows us to work as a species.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right.
We're not that fast in terms of the animal kingdom, not that strong. We can't swim very well. We certainly can't fly, right? What we do well is what we do together.
We work together.
And if we're losing our empathy, we're losing the catalyst, the force that allows us to do that. And I'll never forget what Sarah told me. She said, well, what goes down can come up. And what she meant by that is that we often imagine that our capacity to understand and care for one another is fixed. That just you're born with a certain level of empathy, you're stuck there for life. Sarah was saying, well, if culturally we are changing, that means that that's not true. Right. It can't be a trait if it's changing like that.
Right.
It must be something that is environmentally affected, where our experiences matter. And if that's true, then we should be able to choose experiences that strengthen our empathy instead of weakening it, including engaging with art and fiction, like you said.
I love that. I love that. What is, I mean, just so curious, like the fiction thing, I read this and I kind of go, huh? Like, why would reading fiction help you to become more empathetic?
The way I think about it is that fiction is empathy's gateway drug. You know, you're not interacting with a real person,
Yeah.
but sometimes interacting with people can be kind of frightening, especially if they're very different from you or if you're in conflict with them.
Yeah.
Right? Those are
Yeah.
experiences that sometimes you feel like you're not up for, but you can always curl up with a book, right? And when you do, you dive into not only the actions of other people, but their interior life, right? When you read fiction, you're reading about people's thoughts and emotions and their experiences, and it's something that actually we can't do in real life. I can't, if I would love to, but I can't enter through your ear and just inhabit your brain. But if I read fiction, or even if I read you writing about your experiences, I would have a clearer view as to what was happening inside you.
That's so cool. You know, we were talking before this about this kind of empathy cliff that we're kind of falling off right now, and how a part of it, I believe, is societal. You know, and especially where we're you know lucky to be in the United States, but it is getting more and more individualistic. And you know, I've got friends who are in places like India and Kuwait where inherently they're always together as a family, and they would almost think it's barbaric the way that we treat our elders. Although, yeah, once you become a kid adult, you just move upstairs and like grandma's here, and we kind of go, well, you know, sorry, mom and dad, like we're kind of busy. We have busy jobs, we have busy lives, so why don't you go to the old person's home?
Yep.
And the very sad stat about that is, what's the average life expectancy when someone goes to an old person's home? 2 years. Wow, which is really sad. And so, you know, it speaks to, there's societal pressures here, societal influences here that are I think, almost unintentionally pushing us in certain ways. And so what it means, and this is, I think, essence of what your mission is you need to fight that. You need to fight against the default way of existing and say, how am I going to focus on the feelings of the other, on bringing people together? And there's many ways that it can manifest. I'm so curious, how did this start for you? Like, what an amazing mission to be on, but like, why is empathy this mission you've taken on, this important mission?
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you raise these kind of cross-cultural issues, which are fascinating. And for me, that's where it starts. My parents are both immigrants. My mom came from Peru, my dad from Pakistan. And they didn't come here when they were like 5 years old, right? They came here when they were 25 for grad school. They really belong to their home cultures in an important way. They met in Pullman, Washington, of all places, where they went to graduate school. And
Can't find that map.
I don't, neither can they probably anymore. But they fell in love, I think, because they felt so foreign in the United States. They found comfort in one another.
Wow.
And now they've been here for 53 years. And I think as they grew accustomed to the U.S., they realized how little they had in common, which is really very little. I can tell you as their only child. And so when I was 8, they started getting divorced, and they went through this long and acrimonious divorce that took 4 or 5 years, and it was really on poor terms. And so in my childhood, really for that whole stretch, I felt was a war zone, really, you know. And my job was to kind of bring peace wherever I could.
Oh my God!
Between these two people, I was 8 when it started.
Oh, this is deep.
Yeah. And you know, it was also a war between very different cultural views of what life is supposed to be. Peru and Pakistan, extremely different.
Yeah.
And so I felt, really, I was sure that both my mother and father were excellent people. They were both terrific parents to me, but I knew how much they just could not see eye to eye on anything else. And so I realized that I could meet them where they each were and come up with some common language that would help us understand one another. I mean, I wouldn't recommend giving that job to an 8-year-old.
Yeah, that's a tall order.
I'm not saying it was an easy time.
Yeah.
But I learned inherently at a deep level that just because two people disagree, even if two people hate each other, it doesn't mean that either of them is bad or even that either one of them is wrong. That each person's reality matters and that you can enter different people's reality if you put in enough work. So that was where I learned that empathy is a skill.
Wow. So this is, I think, a really important moment, which is there's a particular type of environment where it's very, very hard to be empathetic. And that's ones that are adversarial. Like, it's really, really hard. And there was a study from your book, of course, which I love. Everyone should read this instantly. It was this prison guard thing where basically these prison guards were taught empathy. Do you remember the study? Could you talk about this? Because it feels like that's kind of a war zone to a certain extent. There's a lot of people who don't want to be in there, and people, there's a lot of conflict.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of studies of people being trained in empathy when they're dealing with difficult situations. One is with parole officers. The one that I wrote most about in my book was police officer training. So this was in the state of Washington. There's, of course, a lot of problems in the U.S., especially with police-civilian encounters, right? A lot of those go in directions that I wish they'd
the last few years.
Yeah. And I think that's in large part because in those situations, everybody feels threat. And one of the quickest ways to shut down a person's empathy is to make them feel as though they are in danger. If you think, I remember talking to a police officer about this, who is one of the people training police officers in empathy. And he says, look, if you tell me that I might not go home to my family, I don't have the energy to care about anyone else. I need to survive the day.
Yeah.
So a lot of what this police training in Washington State under Sue Rahr, who is this incredible sort of police training sort of leader, a lot of it is focusing police officers on, instead of getting in a position of threat, getting in a state of curiosity, trying to figure out, well, what is happening with this other person? And it turns out that there are lots of ways to do that. You can do role-playing exercises. You can do all sorts of training.
It's PG.
Yeah. Very PG, yeah. Where you teach people through experience that just because there's something happening that you don't like, it doesn't mean that you're in danger. And actually, that the vast majority of people who police officers encounter are not dangerous, rather they are in danger, right? And if you just flip that framework, and what Sue did was she changed the police mentality from what she calls a warrior mentality, where you are the adversary of the people you're encountering, to a guardian mentality, that your job is to protect the people that you encounter. And even if they're acting in a way that is unusual or even seems dangerous, first think about how you can protect the community, and then, if you need to, you can escalate. But that it became not their default any longer.
God, it makes so much sense. I mean, it's. I was talking to a friend about how you can start up big conversations, and it's there's kind of these 15 questions you should always just have in your head.
Yeah.
But the caveat to that was you can't just ask the questions. You have to be genuinely curious.
Yeah,
otherwise, they're going to know you're just kind of forward it.
And wait, Healey, let's build on that, because I think it's a really great point. You can talk about that in really fraught interactions like police and civilians. But I think that that's true of any disagreement that you have with anybody. Any disagreement, what's this, marital spat or the conflict between a product team, people can easily get in a state of threat. And one of the best things to do to avoid that or to de-escalate that conflict is to try to flip yourself to genuine curiosity. So if you know you're going to have a conversation with someone where you know you disagree about something, one of the first things that I suggest that people do is, before that conversation, write down all the things you don't know about where that person stands.
Oh, that's such a great idea.
Because you're probably making tons of assumptions about them.
Oh, it's such a good idea.
Then write down all the things you think you do agree on. Because oftentimes when we disagree, we actually agree on 90%. We disagree about 10%, but we spend 90% of our time talking about the 10%.
Right, yeah.
And just those two tactics, trying to exercise humility, what you don't know, and pointing at common ground, turns out to really de-escalate all sorts of conflict quite quickly.
Wow. That is so tactical. Thank you. I'm going to use that immediately. I have a feeling my marriage is going to get a lot better starting tonight.
Guarantee you.
Yeah. So here's one of the things that I think is so interesting about your work, Jamil, is that you obviously came from this very interesting childhood experience where you realize this is very important on a human level. There's a certain feeling that is kind of survivalist about that, I imagine.
Yeah.
But now you spend a lot of time working with surprising companies on the importance of bringing empathy into the workplace. And one of the things I find so fascinating is whenever you have a company that shows a lot of empathy to their employees or takes care of them or does things that are, they feel like they're not purely profiteering in a kind of austerely capitalistic sense, it turns out those companies outperform other companies that don't do it. And so we talked a little bit about this before, but let's talk about empathy in the workplace.
Yeah.
And why it matters, how it ends up leading to the bottom line.
Yeah, when I published The War for Kindness, it's been 6 years now. I didn't know how people would react to it. I didn't know who would be drawn to it. And one of the surprising things to me was that some of the people who reached out the most were leaders in companies and other organizations saying, we need this in our workplace. We need more of this. And so for the last several years, I've been working with companies and also learning as much as I can about workplace empathy. And Healey, you are exactly right that the organizations that invest in their people do better at a bottom line level. And for some reason, leaders around the world just don't seem to get this.
Why is that?
I think there's a stereotype, and not to get too philosophical, but I think there's a stereotype about capitalism itself, that it must be a zero-sum game.
Yes.
That in order to win, in order to produce, somebody needs to lose so that you can win.
Yes.
That is a very creaky, and even Adam Smith would disagree with that. I mean, that's just a misunderstanding of the way that capitalism, I think, actually works. But I think it drives leaders to think, well, if I'm being nice to people, then I must be sacrificing on productivity or on the bottom line, or on efficiency or accountability. I hear this all the time. Yeah. And the truth is very clear, and at this point uncontroversial scientifically, that the opposite is true, right? That when you invest in people, when you show that you are listening to them, I'm not talking about empathy meaning we're going to turn every team meeting into a group therapy session and have lots of tissue. We're all weeping and hugging each other. Empathy in the workplace simply means trying to understand people better and show them that you care about them as people and that you want them to do well. I mean, there is nothing, to me, soft and squishy about that. That's, again, what makes people succeed together. There's now 20 years of data showing that, in fact, when you do that, people don't turn over as much from the workplace. They take more creative risks and innovate more. They collaborate more effectively and share knowledge more. And ultimately, you succeed as an organization. And the funny thing to me is that the same leaders who don't seem to get this are the ones who pride themselves on being so data-driven.
Despite all the data.
And it's like, are you not looking at the data here?
Yeah.
Because it's really one of the most efficient things that you can do in terms of return on investment is just try to pay attention to the people in your workplace as people.
God, I love that. And I think this is evidenced by, and we obviously can't mention the clients, but some of the clients you work with are like the biggest names in private equity hedge funds. And you are consulting them on how to do this. Like, what are some of the interesting approaches and/or lessons that have come from that? Like, they'll say this is going to work. What are some of the things that are happening there? Because that's a place you wouldn't think to look for empathy.
I'm relatively new to the world of private equity. It is a space in which people pay a lot of attention to numbers.
Yes,
they diligence everything, and it turns out that if one of those very smart, quantitatively driven people stumbles upon the research on empathy, they see it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so I think that now this is going to be a leading edge differentiator in a lot of industries, I think, which especially I would say in an age of greater automation, right? So people and leaders who understand that at this moment is when this is the moment that we need to focus more on people, not less. I think that those are going to be the industry leaders in whatever industry.
Right away. Yeah, I remember talking that there's a feelings you have when you used to walk in offices, you still can, obviously. I remember I walked into a couple service offices, and then I walked into the Airbnb office. Mm. And it was like this electric energy you could feel. And so because you could feel they cared about each other and they were there for it, there's something about that where, gosh, what an interesting, imagine being a public stock analyst. What if you could have an empathy index of the company? That was one of the biggest predictors of success.
There is, and it is.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Belinda Palmer in the UK formed an empathy index. Now, what she puts into it, the ingredients in it, are not the same ones that I would put in, right? It's things like what benefits the company has, and because she's using the metrics that she can have as an outsider, which I think is a great place to start. What I'm doing now, in collaboration with some private equity folks, is looking at dozens of different companies where I can directly measure the empathy of CEOs and directly measure the perceived empathy that how much employees think that their company cares about them. And if you look deeper, then the correlations are even stronger.
Wow.
And I think, Healey, to your point, why aren't people doing this more? I think first there's this creaky stereotype that if I'm empathic, I'm weak. We can just, I think, discard that now. But
please, everyone, discard that. Yeah.
But second is the idea that, well, even if it was helpful, it's not something that can be trained. And one of the big things that we're talking about here today is that absolutely it can be learned and it can be taught. And that's really the mission that I'm on now, is to bring people simple practices like the disagreement prompts that I just made you, right?
Yeah.
There are very simple things that you can adjust about the way that you relate to people that can improve not just your sense of understanding and care for them, but their sense that you care for them, right? Because empathy is a matter of two people's perceptions.
Right.
It's my perception of you,
right?
It's your perception of whether I'm really seeing you or not.
I think there's the question, which is there are things you can do that are objectively empathetic, better benefits, whatever it is, and those don't always. This can fall flat unless you do it right. Any examples of that you've seen? Recently?
I think that one really interesting example is unlimited PTO. That sounds super.
Sounds great.
It sounds very caring.
Yes.
To give people unlimited PTO.
Yeah.
You may know that companies that do that, people actually take less PTO because the written rule is take as much time as you want.
Right.
But what is the unwritten rule?
Yeah.
What is the cultural norm? People don't just listen to rules, they listen to the people around. Exactly.
Right.
And so that's one example where I think a very empathic sounding policy is often matched with a very unempathic vibe, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's like one of those there's agreements and there's expectations, and if the expectation is considerably different in the written agreement, probably very confusing. I think you'd also mentioned, though, like there's a private equity firm you're working with that said, okay, whenever we pick up a company, we're going to force the ownership to provide equity to everyone. Mm-hmm. But it didn't work.
Well, it worked sometimes.
Okay.
And it didn't work other times.
Okay.
And they were wondering, why is it that we thought this would be a magic bullet and people would be super engaged and productive. You're an owner now. It's great. And what they learned is that, well, if all it is just numbers on a piece of paper, people felt much less moved by that act. But if the leadership of an organization said, we're making you owners because we believe in you, just that simple shift of focus and framing accelerated people's engagement along with getting equity. So it's not just about what you do for people, it's about how you explain what you're doing for them. And if you say, I'm doing this because I see you as a human being and I want you to thrive, the same action can have double, triple the impact.
Wow. So I want to talk about this idea you had, which is like how empathy spreads in a positive way, like there's a positive contagion.
Yeah.
There's these social network researchers, Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler. They found that when you have acts, kind of like the whole paying it forward idea, that when you had acts of kindness or acts of empathy, it didn't just directly affect the next person. It had a lasting effect that would kind of like exponentially expand from there.
Absolutely.
Here's the question is, what's one of the most powerful examples you've seen of empathy cascading outward? And how can leaders, let's say you're a founder, let's say you're an executive, how can leaders start to spark that ripple internally?
Wow, it's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of examples of, and I should say, kindness ripples outward, but so does unkindness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to be intentional about the way that we act towards other people, not just because we will impact them, but because we will impact the person that they're with next. If you're a leader and you treat your employees some way, you're having an indirect effect on the evening that their family has today, right? And so I think it's important to understand that all sorts of behaviors ripple outward. One example that I'll talk about, and sorry to talk about my own work, but a study that we did that a study. One of my favorite studies that we've done in the lab is we work with 7th graders.
Huh?
Now, 7th grade is famously not always the most empathic time in people's life. I don't know how 7th grade
Well, I'm
was.
seeing a lot.
Yeah. And a lot of, judgment, and
Yes.
he's making fun of each other, a lot of bullying and cruelty, really.
Yeah.
And we wondered whether one reason for that is because maybe just like CEOs think empathy is weak, maybe 7th graders think that it's for dorks. Maybe they think it's not very popular. And so we
I wanted
wanted
to bring Dork back.
Yeah.
It's such a classic.
We need it. We need more. I think, but we need dork pride now.
Yeah.
We need to reclaim it.
At NSF, we have a lot of Dork pride.
I hope so, yes. And so we went to a bunch of middle schools around the Bay Area, and we asked 7th graders to privately and anonymously write, well, how do you feel about empathy? And we found that it pulled through the roof, but that students didn't know that their peers felt the same way. And we find this actually in all sorts of different environments. In companies, I'll often ask people, I'll survey people, how much do you want empathy to be at the center of your work? How do you think your average colleague would answer the same question? Huge differences. People want it, but they don't realize everybody else does. The same is true at Stanford, by the way, among our undergraduate student body.
Wow.
And what we did at these middle schools is we said, okay, well, now we want you to write about why you think empathy is a positive social quality, why you like it. And then all of these responses were anonymous, but we collated them so that when students came back to the class, they could see a brochure of all of their friends and classmates saying why they valued it.
Oh my gosh.
In essence, showing people, hey, did you know empathy is super popular?
That is so beautiful, man.
Well, what was beautiful to me is the way that the kids reacted. Because when they saw that, they said, wow, okay, I'm now motivated to be more empathic. We, by the way, did this in some classrooms, and then other classrooms were a control group. And we found that in the classrooms that learned how popular empathy was, a month later, kids were nicer to each other.
Wow.
They did more favors to each other. They helped each other
Wow.
more often. And to me, I think one of the messages here is that actually, in order to make empathy spread, one of the things you need to do is just show people how much others want it. We underestimate how much other people want to connect with us.
Yes.
You were saying, earlier we were talking about how we take our kids to the playground, and the parents are just talking to their kids, and it's like they've got blinders on. They don't want to talk to anybody else.
Yes.
Oftentimes, we act as though everybody wants to be alone, but secretly, and as you probably know, there's a loneliness epidemic.
Yes.
We are so hungry for connection,
So hungry.
but it's hard to take that first step.
Yes.
And one way to help people take that first step is to show them, hey,
Everyone else wants it.
everybody else wants it. That's a way to create a ripple of empathy, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm actually thinking about how I'm writing a ton of notes, by the way. This is so great. Thank you again. I run a company, Boopop. I'm so passionate about everyone at that company, and I want to start a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Or hopefully enhance what they already feel.
Yeah.
Can I just send a survey out and share it?
So again, dork pride, but I think that the best first step is often data, right? Because in these middle schools, what a lot of schools do is they have socio-emotional learning, where teachers tell you, you should really be empathic. Well, if you're 13, the last thing you want to do is what a teacher tells you. And Healey, not to put you in the position of a teacher for 7th graders, but sometimes if the CEO says, I want you all to be nicer to each other, I mean, that's a nice thing to say, but it's coming from the top. It doesn't feel genuine. So I think one really powerful thing that data can do, and I do this with many of the companies I work with, is to, again, start with the survey and show people what they want instead of saying what you want them to do.
Totally.
Say, wow, we've discovered that what people want here is more human connection, and there's 6 different ways that we can do it. And another thing, Healey, if you want this to sort of bloom at Boompop,
Yes.
is to add to that maybe a campaign of what I call positive gossip. That is, we usually gossip about the crappy things that people do. In my lab, we found that people gossip 3 times more often when they see somebody do something selfish than when they see somebody do something kind.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and I think that's for a good reason, actually, because we're trying to protect
It
people.
feels tribal.
Yes, we're trying to protect the tribe, But it gives people the wrong idea about what a community is like.
Yes.
So one of the things that I encourage in my lab, and that I am encouraging at Stanford as well, is for when you catch somebody doing something positive, and I don't just mean performing really well, doing something kind for somebody else, elevate that.
Yeah.
Talk about that. Center that in your community conversations.
I love that. This is I'm taking out so many words. Actually, this is awesome. Okay, so here's like you mentioned isolation, and I think there's a lot of news out there about how loneliness is an epidemic and people are really feeling it. And I believe you've talked and thought about in the past about how people are introverts who might just be a little more nervous, and there's ways to help them to feel less isolated and to show them it's actually like a lovely thing that makes everyone like. How do you do like? Let's say I have some introverts in my company, and I know they're amazing. I want them to feel better. I want empathy to flow. I want them to feel more part of things. Like, what do I do?
There's terrific research on this, and the best person to read here for people who want to go deeper is Nick Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago.
Okay.
Brilliant guy, and he studies this idea called undersociality, which is the notion that people don't realize how much others want to connect, and so they avoid trying. Because I call these social shark attacks. Like nobody dies of shark attacks almost, right? I mean, obviously it's horrible when it happens, but it's extraordinarily rare.
Very rare, yeah.
And yet, because of Jaws and because it's such a vivid fear for so many people, we greatly overestimate. Like, I don't know, when I was a kid, I was like,
I'm here in front of the water.
I would go to Cape Cod, and that's right, when Jaws came, I was like, if I go in that water even more than 5 feet,
I'm gonna die.
I'm going to be chopped in half immediately, right? And socially, likewise, we all know the feeling of sitting down in a plane, and the person sits next to you, and they look really nice, but you're like, oh man, if I try to talk to this person, they're going to put their headphones on.
Yeah.
They're going to say something. It's going to be so awkward. They're going to hate me. Somebody's going to make fun of me or whatever. And those are like shark attacks. If you actually try it, you learn that never happens, almost never.
Oh, I love that.
But they loom so large in our mind that they freeze us in place. God. And so what Nick does is he has these studies where he asks people, imagine that in your commute this morning, you were to talk to a stranger. Yeah. How do you think that would go? And people are like, I think it would be terrible. They would hate me. It would be awkward. It would not be positive. It would be the worst 10 minutes of my day. And then Nick has a separate group of people, and he says, I need you to go and talk to somebody. And then afterwards he says, how was that? And they're like, it was phenomenal. This person and I had a lot in common. They were so friendly. The commute flew by. I made a new friend. It was the best 10 minutes of my day. Wow. And he shows over and over again that if you just, for lack of a better term, force people to just jump in, just dip their toe in the water, they realize that there are no sharks there, and actually it's pretty friendly.
Wow. Gosh, I mean, what are the themes in this? I'm kind of thinking about like the mindset people have in companies, the fear that that you can't be nice because someone has to lose, or this fear that people are gonna reject you or do whatever it is. It's a lot of this kind of like scarcity. This is a little woo-woo, but it's a lot like scarcity mindset versus abundant mindset. And I can't help but think there's this book that I love called Adrift by Scott Galloway. Mm-hmm. It's History of the United States in 100 charts. Yeah. And he has these really painfully contrasting charts where he shows the perception that people have that the world is worse off than it was in the past. Mm-hmm. Every year it's worse and worse. Yep. It shows the amount of article titles that have some sort of negativity or anger evocation or whatever it is, in contradistinction to worldwide poverty is the lowest it's ever been. Yep. Quality of life is the best it's ever been. Nonviolent crimes are the lowest it's ever been. And I think you kind of brought a point that there's this human tendency to focus on the negative because we are all about preservation of our whatever. That's right. Tribe, people, group, family, life. Yeah. We are born to survive for the most part. Mm-hmm. So if someone isn't forcing you, let's say you are the introvert and you are in the community, no one's forcing you to do it. How do you get out of there? How do you push yourself to take that step? Because I feel like if people will just start doing this, the ripple effects on a macro level would be wonderful. And part of it might be fun.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, you're getting at something super deep here. We started the conversation about, to be kind, to try to bring out empathy is a war. But what is it a war against? Yeah. A lot of people think it's a war against human nature because we are fundamentally selfish creatures who just want to survive and only want to look out for ourselves, and everything is zero sum, and we've got this scarcity mindset embedded in us, and so we need to fight who we are in order to be kinder. I actually think that's completely wrong. I think that what we need to fight is the perception that our culture has given us of who we are. Scott puts it beautifully, right? We're the safest we've ever been, but we feel like we're in more danger. We're the wealthiest that we've ever been, and we feel like we're poorer.
Yep.
We're the healthiest that we've ever been, and we feel like we're sicker. And there's all sorts of charts like that. And yes, we focus on threats because doing so helps us survive, or at least it did 200,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. But now, that same bias towards the negative is killing us.
Wow.
Because it's obscuring what we really are. I think that a fight for empathy is not a fight against human nature. It's a fight to recuperate our true nature, which is as a hypersocial, collaborative, for lack of a better term, loving species.
That is our natural state.
Yes. Yeah.
I was reading this book called Stolen Focus recently.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Johann Hari, yeah.
Yeah, guys. Yeah. I'm reading up that you actually know it. This is a wonderful dynamic.
This is related to how is a lot of us feel like, of course, our ability to focus has gone down since the advent of smartphones, 2007 being the big moment.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it happened much earlier. It's been 100 years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
With the advent of the newspaper. That was the thing where all of a sudden you have access to more data than was just in your locality. And as humans, we're always trying to kind of assess threat and risk for all our basic needs to survive. And as a result, you wanted as much information as possible. But we can only really handle so much information.
Yeah.
And so you start shedding synthesis, start shedding the ability to focus on things, and this has been accelerating. And it reminded me of this, I forget the study, it was this professor who said, I just did something that got all my ratings for my class up by a full point. My average 3.5, now it's 4.5. I didn't change the material, I didn't change my slides, I didn't change anything for one rule. That rule was, no computers, no phones in my classroom.
Yep.
That's it. He said, all my lectures will be recorded. You can look online, whatever you want. You could have a piece of paper and a pen to write it. And everyone was happier and enjoyed it more.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I've been, and I think it's related because it's so easy. It's less calories to just go on your phone. I mean, this is even I saw this study that showed that the amount of times the average seventh grader goes out to parties now. In the 1970s, it was 2 times a week, and it was like the huge portion of kids would do that, 80%. Now it's sub 10%.
Wow.
People are being less social because it's just so easy to do this. And so one of the things I force myself to do, and so hard, is I take my phone and put it in my back pocket, and I'll just stand on the elevator. And if it's embarrassed this morning, I just go over, and I just say, hey, how you doing? And, these environments are like a workout class. You're so close, no one talks. The moment you break the ice, everyone's so relieved. They're not open to it. They are relieved.
They're relieved. They're giving it. You're giving them a chance to be who they really are.
Yes.
Nick puts it beautifully. He says, nobody says hi, but everybody says hi back.
God, that's so true.
And it really is. I think that, first of all, I completely co-sign. I teach Psych 1 at Stanford, 400 students, and no computers, no phones in the class as well, for a very similar reason. But I think, to build on Scott Galloway's point, right? People think the world is terrible. They think other human beings are terrible. Yes. Our faith in humanity dropping year over year.
Yes.
But there's an exit hatch for this, an escape hatch, which is if you ask those same people about the folks who they encounter in real life, not only do they have a lot more faith in those people, but our faith in the people we encounter in 3 dimensions as carbon-based organisms has remained high at the same time that our sense about people has plummeted. And so when we go on our phones, when we go on our screens, and we take at face value the information that we're getting, we need to remember that information is not unfiltered, right? That we are being fed information that is systematically pulling us apart and hurting us in the fact that it's making us more isolated, less trusting, more polarized, and lonelier.
And I think, I know we're short of time here, but I also think that this is, the criticality of this is exponential now with these AI agents who are just available all the time. And obviously I run a company where the whole point is to put your phone away and get together in person. I believe that's a critical part, like humans as a species who work together, that's how we, survive, is there's nothing as important, I believe, than in-human connection. And the fastest, the most effective way to nail in-person connection is empathy. Yeah, and curiosity, asking questions and getting into it. So
I think that a program to bring people together in person that would be combined with just a couple of empathy nudges could be extraordinary.
Yeah, amen. I wish we could talk for like an entire day. Thank you so much. Okay, so two last questions. One is, if there were one thing you wish someone, that you are the world's expert in empathy, which is so awesome, and I'm so grateful you were here. I mean that. If there were one thing you wish someone had told you earlier on in your life, either in your career or when you're the 8-year-old, about empathy or about kindness, what would it be? What would the lesson be?
I think it's related to what we're talking about now, that actually the empathy deficit, which a lot of people talk about, isn't a function of people being unable to empathize. I think it's a function of people not asking for enough empathy from each other, not being vulnerable enough to say what they need and to turn to people, to open up to people. I think that the next time that you consider, Healey, asking somebody for a favor or even being vulnerable to them and asking for their support, something that you should remember is that you are giving that person a chance to express the deepest parts of who they are, and that when they do so, they will feel more fulfilled and happier and healthier. So when we ask people for help, we should say, "You're welcome for the chance to help me." I think that people, in essence, I don't think that the empathy deficit is a supply issue. I think it's a demand issue, and we should ask more of each other because we're dying to give to each other, but we can't do that until somebody asks.
I love it. Okay, so Jamil, this has been so wonderful. Let's say I'm listening, and I'm a founder, I'm a CEO, I'm an executive, and I want to know, how do I get more of this into my organization? How do people find you? How do they reach you?
Oh, well, I'm pretty easy to find. My website's Jamil-Zaki. I'm on a bunch of social media platforms. And I'm building this program called the Empathy Gym, which is meant for communities that want to apply the science of empathy in modular, bite-sized ways. So that's something I'm really excited about right now.
Are you joking?
Yeah.
I'll want a membership. Jamil, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is delightful.